You didn't arrive here by accident. Something inside, something ancient and quietly persistent, drew you here. And as these words begin to settle within you, you may not fully understand why just yet. But that's okay. The truth is, real healing doesn't always show up as fireworks or a dramatic revelation. Often, it arrives disguised as silence. A subtle pulse beneath the surface, not caused by the outside world, not provoked by circumstance, but born deep within you. Something shifting, something reassembling the pieces you once tried to hide. Healing begins the moment you stop trying to erase chapters from your life. The parts you were ashamed of, the moments you wanted to skip, those are the exact pieces being called home. Wholeness comes not by replacing your pain with light, but by letting the darkness speak. As Carl Jung once hinted, transformation doesn't happen by covering the shadow with light. It happens when the darkness is finally seen, when it becomes part of your conscious self. And it is in that seeing, that accepting, where your soul begins to realign itself. You may not even realize it, but signs of your healing are already blooming beneath the surface. One of the most telling? The quiet end of your inner war. That relentless self-conflict that once left you exhausted is slowly softening. Not because you've convinced yourself that everything's fine, but because you've stopped forcing yourself into shapes that don't fit. There's now room to observe your emotions without flinching, space to feel what you feel, without demanding that it look prettier or feel easier. You start speaking to yourself differently, gentler. You're no longer punishing yourself for having feelings. You've stopped measuring your worth by how quickly you can bounce back or prove your strength. There's a deeper honesty emerging in your inner dialogue, but it's laced with kindness now, and that kindness isn't weakness. It's a new form of strength, one that doesn't build walls, but rather invites every version of you to come and sit at the table. This shift doesn't happen overnight. It unfolds gradually, choice by choice. Every time you resist the urge to judge yourself harshly, every time you choose patience over self-criticism, the healing deepens. You begin to recognize that power isn't found in pretending to be unbothered. Real strength is being able to stand in the storm with your heart wide open, to cry without shame, to fall and still call it progress. And slowly, the chaos within you begins to still, not because you've solved every problem, but because you've stopped fighting your own nature. You learn that you can be furious and still worthy of love, that you can stumble and still be evolving, that fear doesn't cancel out your courage, it walks alongside it. This is the beginning of becoming whole, not by being flawless, but by being fully present with who you truly are. You start to realize that the version of you who used to flinch at their own reflection no longer runs and hides. There's a calmness growing in your chest, not loud, not triumphant, but steady. You no longer feel the constant pressure to change everything about yourself just to deserve peace. That urgency begins to fade, and in its place, something rare appears: presence. You are no longer trying to outrun your flaws. You are beginning to exist within them, breathing through them with grace. Your heart, once a battleground, begins to feel like a home again, not because pain has disappeared, but because you've stopped treating it like an intruder. It has become a visitor with a story to tell, and you've become willing to listen, not every day, not perfectly, but often enough that your inner world has stopped feeling like a war zone. The resistance softens, and what takes its place is understanding, a kind of sacred stillness that holds space for your past without needing to rewrite it. It's not that life suddenly feels easy. It's that you no longer collapse under its weight. You've developed a deeper kind of stamina, not physical, but emotional, one that allows you to be both tender and tenacious. You are learning to move through discomfort without needing to numb it. You can sit with sorrow and not be swallowed by it. This is not just healing. It is self-respect in its highest form. It is the act of witnessing your own survival and honoring it. This shift begins to show in your body too. The invisible tension you carried for years starts to dissolve. Maybe your shoulders drop a little. Maybe your breathing deepens without effort. You sleep a bit more peacefully, not because your days are carefree, but because your nights no longer echo with shame. You no longer abandon yourself to keep moving. Instead, you carry yourself with care, like someone who finally understands their own worth. Even your so-called flaws become softer in your eyes. The moments that once embarrassed you, the emotions you once tried to hide, now feel less threatening. You don't rush to explain yourself anymore. You don't edit your emotions to make them more digestible. You feel, and you allow yourself to feel. You fall apart, and you no longer interpret it as failure. You've begun to see your humanness as sacred, not as something that needs to be fixed. And in that sacred seeing, you stop performing. You stop trying to fit into other people's comfort zones. You no longer contort yourself to be acceptable. Instead, you walk with all your contradictions, your uncertainties, your quiet triumphs. You wear them openly, not as burdens but as badges of truth. The masks you used to wear feel heavier now. You're not afraid to take them off, because for the first time the face underneath feels like enough. Something shifts when you begin to revisit your past, not to dwell, not to reopen wounds, but to finally witness your story without flinching. The memories that once tightened your chest now feel less sharp, not because they vanished, but because you've changed the way you hold them. They no longer define your worth. They've become part of the sacred tapestry of your becoming woven in, not erased, not glamorized, just fully seen and finally respected. You don't look back with resentment anymore. You look back with a wiser heart, a heart that can remember the pain, but no longer crumbles under it. You understand now that those hard chapters didn't ruin you. They revealed you. You've stopped trying to rewrite the past and started honoring it for what it taught you. Even the moments that once made you question everything, especially those moments. Because now, you see them as the fire that forged your strength. You're no longer haunted by the person you were when you didn't know what you now know. That version of you wasn't a mistake. She was doing what she could with the tools she had. And now, instead of judging her, you thank her, because she got you here. She made choices you would no longer make. But even in her fear or confusion, she kept going, and that deserves more grace than guilt. That deserves reverence, not regret. This reverence reaches places shame used to live. You no longer wince at your old self. You welcome her. You let her rest. You stop trying to explain why you didn't do things differently. You stop the self-interrogation. Instead, you embrace the truth. You were surviving. You were learning. And now that you've grown, you choose to love yourself, not in spite of those versions, but because of them. That kind of love changes everything. You stop seeing your past as a chain. It becomes a root, not something that traps you, but something that grounds you. You realize you're not starting from scratch. You're building on sacred ground. The same ground where you once fell apart is now the place where you rise with new awareness. Your story isn't a cautionary tale. It's a living map, and every misstep, every heartbreak, every silence was part of your sacred route home. And in this new light, your scars stop shouting. They no longer demand attention. They simply exist, quiet, tender, full of memory, but no longer raw. Your narrative no longer ends in pain. It continues through healing. You don't speak from the open wound anymore. You speak from the scar, and from that place, your voice doesn't tremble. It carries. Because it's not just a voice of survival, it's a voice of transformation. There comes a moment when you realize forgiveness isn't just something you offer to others, it's something you must learn to give yourself. And not just once, but again and again. You forgive the version of you who stayed too long in places that dimmed your light. You forgive the silence you held when you were aching to speak. You forgive the grip you kept on people who couldn't meet you where you were. This kind of self-forgiveness doesn't excuse it, release it, and as that release unfolds, so does a softer gratitude. Not the kind that sugarcoats your suffering, but the kind that honors what it shaped in you. You look back on those long, dark nights and recognize that something inside you was being born. You weren't breaking, you were becoming. The gratitude that rises now isn't loud. It's not about pretending everything was beautiful. It's the kind that knows the beauty was in how you kept showing up for yourself when no one else knew what you were carrying. Your past no longer feels like a burden to outrun. It becomes your foundation, not something that cages you, but something that steadies you. You understand now that your hardest seasons weren't detours, they were deep initiations into self-awareness, into self-trust. And the more you integrate them, the less you need to defend your path. Your story is no longer a wound to hide. It becomes a connection point, a bridge between your experience and someone else's unspoken pain. You stop chasing validation. You're not trying to be seen anymore. You're trying to be real. And in that realness, you find others who aren't looking for a polished version of you, but the truth of you. People who meet you where you are, who don't flinch at your depth, who walk beside you, not because they need you to shrink, but because your wholeness inspires their own. That kind of relationship doesn't drain, it nourishes. You become less reactive and more rooted, no longer pulled into arguments just to feel heard, no longer needing to be right to feel safe. You understand that peace isn't found in winning. It's found in choosing what's worth your energy. You walk away not because you're cold, but because you're clear. You stay not because you're afraid of being alone, but because it's true. The noise that used to surround you begins to fade, because your inner world is no longer chaotic. And in that quiet, you hear something new, your own voice. Clearer now. Uninterrupted by doubt or distortion. That voice no longer needs permission. It no longer begs to be believed. It just is. It speaks less, but with more weight. And that weight is not heavy. It's holy, because it rises from a place of peace that can't be shaken. You've stopped chasing clarity in other people. You've found it in yourself. There's a certain power that rises in you when you begin to act from your center instead of your chaos. It's not loud or showy. It's not the kind of power that needs to be proven. It's a calm, steady strength that grows from the inside out. You find that you're no longer reacting to every discomfort, every opinion, every trigger. You're responding, instead, from awareness, not from fear, from stillness, not from the need to be seen. This change doesn't come from pretending. It doesn't come from suppressing your truth. It comes from making peace with your inner world, the parts of you that used to fight each other for control. You no longer need to armor up to face the day. You no longer move through life on edge, bracing for impact. Your energy becomes smoother, more consistent. There's a rhythm to your being now that no longer rises and falls with every external shift. And because you're no longer scattered inside, your outer world begins to mirror that coherence. You speak more thoughtfully. You pause more often. Not because you're unsure, but because you've learned the sacred art of listening, especially to yourself. You recognize that rushing doesn't create clarity. That urgency often drowns your inner voice. So now, you wait, you breathe, you move with intention, not reaction. And that shift makes everything different. Your boundaries, too, become clearer, not as defenses, but as declarations of self-respect. You don't set them to punish others. You set them to protect your peace. And you no longer explain them away. You don't need to. The clarity in your energy speaks for itself. You're not shutting the world out. You're just no longer letting it rearrange your internal furniture every time it knocks on your door. And because you've stopped abandoning yourself, you no longer tolerate spaces that ask you to dim. You walk away from conversations that echo with old wounds. You choose silence over noise. You choose presence over performance. You don't chase what feels forced. You wait for what feels aligned, not because you're passive, but because you finally understand the cost of sacrificing your inner truth. This is what it means to be whole, not perfect, not unshakable, but rooted. Your decisions don't come from fear anymore. They come from clarity, from the wisdom of someone who has met all their inner storms and still found their way back home. You carry your truth now, not like a weapon, but like a compass. And that kind of inner direction changes everything you touch. You begin to notice that your inner landscape has shifted. The noise that once overwhelmed your mind now seems distant, like an echo fading in the background, not because life has grown silent, but because you've grown still inside. You're no longer pulled apart by conflicting emotions. They still arrive, but now they coexist without chaos. Sadness doesn't cancel joy. Fear doesn't erase courage. You've learned to let your emotions speak without letting them steer. This new alignment reveals itself in how you handle missteps. You don't unravel over one mistake anymore. You no longer interpret uncertainty as failure. You're not starting from zero every time you fall. Instead, you see it all as part of the same journey, a journey that honors both the stumbles and the strides. There's no pressure now to have it all figured out. There's only the willingness to stay in motion, even when the path feels unclear. And in that motion, something sacred is born, resilience without rigidity. You don't snap under tension, you bend, you adjust. But you do not break, because you've stopped filtering life through the lens of who you had to be to survive. You're responding as who you truly are now, someone integrated, someone present, someone whole. You don't need applause to feel valid. You don't need understanding to be at peace. You just need alignment with yourself. Even the silence that once scared you now feels like a sanctuary. You don't dread the quiet. You lean into it. Because now, when the world grows still, you don't meet emptiness. You meet yourself. And that presence, your own company, no longer feels like a cage. It feels like home. You've stopped chasing stimulation just to avoid discomfort. You've stopped needing noise to feel alive. You've made peace with stillness. And in that stillness, clarity grows. This clarity transforms how you move through the world. You no longer carry your energy like a defense. You carry it like a blessing. You don't demand to be heard. You allow yourself to be felt. People sense the shift in you. They may not be able to name it, but they know. They feel your groundedness. They feel your boundaries without needing an explanation. They feel your peace, and it softens their own noise. That's the power of true healing. It's not something you wear like armor. It's something you become. Quietly, authentically, unmistakably. And it doesn't need to be proven. It's the stillness in your eyes, the steadiness in your breath, the grace with which you hold both your light and your shadow. That grace becomes your signature, your sacred way of being in a world still learning how to feel. A deep sense of maturity takes root when you no longer visit your past to assign blame, but to understand. You no longer dig through old memories to prove a point. You return to gather wisdom. You notice the doors that were once left ajar by old pain. And instead of pretending they aren't there, you walk back to them, gently, and close them with reverence. Not out of bitterness, out of liberation. This is what it means to reclaim yourself without revenge. Even nostalgia begins to change texture. It doesn't consume you. It visits you softly. You can feel it without drowning in it. You can acknowledge what was beautiful and also what was harmful, without confusing the two. You no longer see your past through the lens of loss alone. Now you see it as a bridge that brought you here, weathered, yes, but still sacred. The ache becomes tender instead of sharp. The story becomes softer in your hand. And perhaps for the first time, you stop needing your past to look different in order to feel peace. You stop needing closure from people who were never able to offer it. You stop waiting for apologies that may never come. You grant yourself the permission to move forward anyway, not because it didn't matter, but because your life matters more. And you realize that peace is something you choose, not something you wait for others to give. From that depth, you begin to respond to life with grace. You don't absorb chaos the way you used to. You don't take everything personally. You don't feel the urgency to prove that you've healed. You just live it, quietly, unapologetically. You speak with honesty, but no longer with the need to be heard by everyone. Your silence, when you choose it, is not passive. It's sacred. It's a space of trust between you and your truth. You don't run from discomfort anymore. You hold it, you sit with it, and in doing so, it loses its power to unmake you. You understand now that not every tension needs resolution. Some of it just needs to be witnessed. Some of it just needs your breath. That's how you reclaim your energy, not by fixing everything, but by honoring what doesn't need to be changed in order to be understood. And so, your presence deepens. It becomes magnetic, not because you are louder, but because you are anchored. You're no longer trying to manage how others see you. You're simply becoming who you were meant to be, all along, unfragmented, rooted, free. This quiet coherence that now lives within you is the evidence of healing. Not flashy, but unmistakable. It's what happens when you choose yourself, without needing the world to clap for it. You also start to recognize the difference between connection and attachment. You no longer cling out of fear, of abandonment, of loneliness, of being misunderstood. You no longer stay just to avoid change. You remain only where your soul is nourished, where authenticity is mirrored, where you don't have to shrink to stay safe. And when it's time to leave, you don't see it as failure, you see it as truth, a necessary honoring of your evolution. Relationships begin to look different. They no longer revolve around validation. They revolve around resonance. You're not seeking someone to fix what feels broken. You're inviting people into the space you've already begun to heal. And in that space, there is room for real connection. You don't chase anymore. You attract by being whole. You stop gravitating toward what feels familiar in your wounds. Now you move toward what feels true in your growth. You notice that when others can't meet you in that space, you don't shrink. You stay rooted. You don't twist yourself to be palatable. You don't keep quiet to maintain peace. You speak gently, but firmly. You love deeply, but without self-erasion. And in doing so, your relationships become clearer, more grounded. You're not looking for someone to rescue you. You've already rescued yourself. And now, love becomes a place of sharing, not seeking. Even in partings, you don't fall apart like you once did. You don't view endings as losses of self. You see them as realignments, as completions. You no longer fight to stay where you've outgrown. You honor the lessons. You honor the love. And then, with grace, you let go. Because your peace is no longer negotiable. And your self-worth is no longer a mirror held in someone else's hand. This doesn't make you detached. It makes you sacredly clear. You're still open, still vulnerable, but no longer wide open to whatever comes. You discern. You listen not just to words, but to energy, to intention. And if something doesn't match your frequency, you walk away, not with resentment, but with reverence for what your soul needs to thrive. You're not proving anything anymore. You're protecting what you've worked so hard to rebuild, your wholeness. And from that place, love finds you differently. It sees the real you, the unpolished, untamed, integrated you. Not because you demanded to be seen, but because you made yourself visible to yourself first. That visibility radiates outward, and those meant to walk with you will feel it. Not because you reached for them, but because you stood where you are in your truth, in your light, in your fullness. A profound shift occurs when solitude no longer feels like exile, but like sanctuary. You're no longer afraid of being alone, because now your own presence feels safe. You've stopped trying to escape your own silence. You're not filling every moment with distraction. In fact, you begin to crave the quiet, not to run from the world, but to return to yourself. And in that return, you find something you never expected. Peace that doesn't demand proof. This peace doesn't ask for applause. It doesn't require you to be productive or profound. It simply exists. It hums in the background of your life like a heartbeat you forgot to notice. And now that you've become quiet enough to hear it, you wonder how you ever lived without it. This is the healing that no one talks about. The kind that doesn't shout, doesn't post, doesn't need validation. It just changes you, and you feel it in how you breathe. You stop measuring your worth by what you achieve. You stop evaluating your healing by how perfect you appear. You no longer see setbacks as signs of failure. You see them as reminders of your humanity. Your value is no longer up for debate. You no longer negotiate your dignity in spaces that don't honor your light. You walk differently now, not faster, not louder, but more fully, more intentionally. You occupy space without apology. And because you've stopped editing your truth, your world begins to shift. You're not seeking people who complete you. You're connecting with those who expand you, who witness you. Not for who you pretend to be, but for who you actually are. There is no pressure to perform. No exhausting need to earn love. You are enough just as you are. And from that truth, love arrives in a more honest form. You speak less, but your words carry more. They come from a place within you that is no longer afraid to be misunderstood. You don't over-explain. You don't dilute your message to keep the peace. You've learned that clarity is peace. And sometimes, clarity means walking alone for a while, but you no longer dread that solitude. You respect it, because you know what's growing in it. And slowly, you stop orbiting around the wounds of your past. You stop shaping your life as a reaction to what hurt you. You're no longer building yourself as an escape route. You're building yourself as a sanctuary, a place where every version of you is welcome, where even the parts that once made you flinch are now allowed to rest. And that is how wholeness is lived. Not spoken, not promised. Lived, moment by sacred moment. You begin to notice something sacred happening in the simplest of moments. It's not about grand awakenings or dramatic turning points anymore. It's in the way you pause before reacting. It's in the breath you take before speaking. It's in the way you choose not to engage in what drains you. These are quiet revolutions, choices made from a place of wholeness. Choices that say, I matter, my peace matters, without needing to explain why. And this new way of being starts to reshape your entire reality. You're no longer rushing to reach the next milestone, to prove that you're okay. You're no longer using success or perfection as a shield against your vulnerability. Instead, you start showing up as you are messy, wise, soft, and fierce. Not to be fixed, but to be present. Not to impress, but to connect. You no longer abandon yourself to be chosen. You choose you first. That choice becomes the foundation of everything. You notice how your energy becomes more selective. You don't give out pieces of yourself so easily anymore. Not because you're guarded, but because you've learned the cost of giving without discernment. Now you ask, is this a space where my truth can live? And if it isn't, you gently leave. Not with judgment, but with deep self-respect. You're not closing your heart. You're honoring its sacredness. Your relationships begin to deepen or dissolve accordingly. What is rooted in truth begins to flourish. What was based on performance or illusion starts to fade. And you let it. You no longer chase what's slipping away. You understand now that when something falls apart, it's not always a loss. It's sometimes a blessing in disguise. You've stopped asking, why did they leave? And started asking, what am I making space for? In that space, new connections form. Not rushed, not desperate, but real. People show up who aren't afraid of your depth, who don't try to fix your emotions or soften your edges. They meet you as you are because that's how they meet themselves. And that kind of presence isn't just rare. It's holy. You're not creating from fear anymore. You're relating from fullness. And that changes the whole frequency of your life. Because now, your energy is no longer about control. It's about coherence. Your power doesn't come from how much you do, but from how aligned you are. And alignment doesn't shout. It doesn't need to. It simply exists. It moves through your body, your choices, your words, your silence, and those around you feel it. Even if they can't name it, they feel that something in you has shifted, and they're drawn not to your image, but to your truth. This inner coherence isn't something you manufacture, it's something you discover, and it lives in the way you walk through the world now. You don't grip life with clenched fists anymore. You hold it with open palms, trusting that what is meant will stay, trusting that you no longer have to force your way through the noise to be heard. There's a steadiness to you now, a knowing that doesn't need constant reinforcement, a presence that doesn't demand recognition to feel real. And it's not that pain has vanished. It still visits. But when it comes, you don't crumble, you don't exile it. You greet it with eyes that have seen it before and know what to do. You no longer label it as wrong. You understand it as information, as a message from your soul, calling for attention, not destruction. You don't treat your discomfort like a sign of failure. You treat it like an opportunity to return to yourself more deeply. You understand now that emotion is not the enemy. It is the compass. And while the world may still teach you to suppress, to numb, to perform, you no longer fall for it. You feel what you feel without shame. You move through your experiences without abandoning your center. Your strength lies not in being unshaken, but in remaining soft in the midst of the shaking. You are the eye of your own storm. And from that stillness, everything begins to clear. Even your relationship with time evolves. You stop racing against it. You no longer obsess over deadlines for healing, for success, for peace. You realize there is no behind, no ahead, only now. And in the now you are whole. In the now you have everything you need to be grounded. You stop making your progress a competition. You stop comparing your awakening to someone else's, because you know that your path is yours, and that's enough. And as you settle deeper into that truth, you begin to notice how life responds to you differently. Not because the world changed, but because you did. Opportunities find you without chasing. Peace stays with you longer. Even the people who once confused you no longer hold power over your emotions. Their chaos doesn't penetrate your clarity. You don't lose sleep over being misunderstood. You simply know who you are now, and that is the most unshakable peace. So you live differently. Not perfectly, but intentionally. You pause when others rush. You speak when it's meaningful. You love without losing yourself. And most importantly, you stay. You stay with yourself. Through it all. Through the joy and the ache. Through the silence and the song. You've become your own safe place. And from that place, you offer something to the world that only wholeness can give. Quiet, rooted, radiant truth. As your foundation grows deeper, you stop fearing uncertainty. You stop needing to control every step. You realize now that trust isn't about knowing what's next. It's about knowing you'll meet whatever comes with presence. You've walked through enough darkness to know that light always finds its way back. So, you stop bracing for disaster. You stop rehearsing pain. You choose to live fully. Even when the path ahead is dim, your own heart becomes the lantern. And when you speak, there's a new kind of silence behind your words, a silence that doesn't come from withholding, but from depth. You no longer need to dominate a room, to feel powerful. Your presence does the speaking for you. You're not loud, but you're felt. You're not always visible, but you're unmistakably real. The way you move, the way you pause, the way you make space for others, it all carries a vibration that only truth can emit. You've stopped performing for approval. You've stopped apologizing for your transformation. The parts of you that once felt too much or not enough are now integrated. You don't hide your fire anymore, but you don't use it to burn either. You use it to warm, to guide, to illuminate. And this quiet glow that surrounds you is not something you can fake. It comes only from someone who has met every version of themselves and chosen to love them all. And that love becomes your new center. Not the kind that demands or controls or begs, but the kind that sees, the kind that steadies. You love others differently now, not from need, but from fullness. You don't love to be chosen. You love because you are love. And when others can't meet you there, you don't shrink. You rise. You bless. You release. And that release is not cold. It's kind. Because now, you understand what sacred detachment really means. It's not about closing your heart. It's about keeping it open, even while letting go. And you do let go, not of people, but of illusions, of expectations that once distorted your peace. You no longer carry the burden of proving your worth. You don't hustle for healing. You've learned to rest, to receive, to walk slowly without shame, because you know that your path isn't a race. It's a remembering, and you're finally remembering who you really are. And with each step, you become lighter. Not because life is easy, but because you no longer carry what isn't yours. You've stopped dragging the weight of others' projections. You've stopped confusing love with sacrifice. You now know that peace doesn't arrive through perfection, it blooms through permission. Permission to be whole, to be seen, to exist in your rawness. That is your power now. Not your performance, not your perfection, but your presence. If you felt a quiet stirring as you heard these words, it's because a deeper part of you is already in motion, a part that has long waited for permission to come forward. This isn't the beginning of your healing, it's the recognition of how far you've already come. You're not just learning how to be whole, you're remembering that you always were. Beneath the survival, beneath the silence, beneath the masks, you were never broken. You were only waiting to be reclaimed. This moment is your return, not to who you were before the pain, but to the you who existed beneath it all. The version of you who never needed to be earned or proven. The version who existed long before the world taught you to doubt your light. And now, you're choosing her, him, them. You're choosing yourself, not as a final act, but as a daily devotion. And that devotion is the most sacred form of healing there is. You no longer need the external world to confirm your worth. You've met your soul in the quiet. You've walked with your shadow and didn't run. You've embraced your anger without shame, your grief without guilt, your joy without apology. You've stopped fragmenting to survive. You've stopped apologizing for your depth. You've stopped shrinking to fit into cages you were never meant to live in. You are whole and you are home. And if your eyes filled with tears at any point on this journey, know this: it wasn't sadness. It was recognition. The soul weeps not just when it's in pain, but when it's finally seen. This message didn't come to fix you. It came to remind you of your sacredness, to honor your journey, to call forth the parts of you that have waited so long to be acknowledged. Your healing isn't loud, but it is undeniable. It lives in how you hold yourself now, with softness and sovereignty. So if these words echoed something inside you, if your breath slowed, if your heart softened, if something long buried rose gently to the surface, don't ignore it. Let this be your sign. Not a beginning, not an end, but a milestone, a marker in your soul's timeline that says, I returned to myself here. I remembered my light here. I reclaimed my peace here. And from this place forward, everything begins to align differently. You are not alone. There is a whole world of souls awakening with you, walking quietly back to themselves, releasing shame, choosing presence. And if you feel called, let this space be one of your homes. Subscribe to stay connected. Share this message with someone who might be walking through their own quiet becoming. Let them know they are not alone. Because your presence here, exactly as you are, is needed. Not one day, but now.